Hi, everybody. This is Mrs. Meyer. I wanted to talk to you today about the agricultural South for your United States history class. The agricultural society emerged in the Southern Colonies. The rural Southern economy, um, it grew because it had the right soil to grow those cash crops. Cash crops, remember, in the South are cotton, indigo, rice, and tobacco. Those four cash crops you are going to need to know. They have long, deep rivers allowing for the planters to ship the goods directly to those markets. The plantations produce most of what the farmers need on their property. So not only are they growing the cash crops, they are also growing food for their own personal families. Let's take a look at some of those homes that they would live in. These are absolutely some of the most beautiful plantation homes in the South. And you can see much, much different than those northern colonies and their city-like atmospheres. So life in the Southern society was very, very diverse. We had a lot of different immigrants to the South. Remember, in the North, they had a lot of Irish immigrants, as well as those Northern Europeans. The Southern population, however, had Germans, Scots, Scot-Irish immigrants, and the Southern population was mostly all small farmers, but they did have those large plantations like I just showed you. By the mid-1700s, growth in export trade makes the colonies very, very prosperous. So they had a couple of different ways to obtain their labor force. The first way was indentured servants. Remember, the indentured servants, they were paid to come over to the New World, and then they had to dedicate a few years, usually about 5 to 7 years, of their lives to the person who brought them over. Okay, in the 1700s, reports of hardship keep the European laborers away. They're starting to realize exactly how hard it is in the New World. The role of women, they had very few legal or social rights. They really didn't have schooling. They cook, clean, garden, and do the family chores. And they really just submitted to their husband's will. So going back to the labor force they had in the Southern colonies, of course, you know they had many, many enslaved people. They were considered the property of others. One of the reasons that the institution of slavery took off was because the Native Americans were increasingly difficult to enslave. They knew how to escape and they didn't submit well to others' requests. The indentured servants, on the other hand, the price for them rised sharply. And so the enslaved people were a lot less expensive. And the white colonists think that the Africans' dark skin justifies slavery. So what I'm going to do now for you students is in your online textbook with your interactive map, I'm going to show you how the enslaved people were brought into the Americas. Okay, so they were utilized as a commodity or something to trade. Okay, so from the Americas, they would bring rum, iron, cloth, tools, and gunpowder. And all of those were then traded for human enslaved people. These all came out of the West African kingdoms. At this point, some of the enslaved people were brought to the West Indies and traded for molasses. From the West Indies, the cargo ships filled with enslaved people would take the molasses and the enslaved people to North America. The molasses was then turned into rum in New York City, and then the cycle would continue. They would consider this the triangle trade route, and the middle passage was the enslaved people being picked up and brought to either the West Indies or North America. Okay, students, and back to our PowerPoint. The Africans cope in their new world. They had very different cultures, language. They tried to preserve their cultural heritage through crafts, music, stories, and dance. They would regularly be split from their families, and the remaining families would then try to raise the children. Of course, as you can imagine, there was much resistance and revolt, and we'll go into the Stono Rebellion a little bit further in the next few units. But the colonists begin to tighten the slave laws, but the rebellions continue. And I just want to show you one last graphic on this podcast. The 13 colonies, the 17th and 18th centuries, the amount of slaves each of the colonies had. The reason this is important, you'll see, is you can see that the institution of slavery really does not take over in the northern and even really the middle colonies quite as much. In New Hampshire, only 500 enslaved people in 1714. Okay, 1740, excuse me. So the red number is what they have in 1740. In Georgia, this is very interesting. Georgia became a colony in 1755. There were only 1,000 colonies, there were only 1,000 enslaved people at the time of the founding. Okay, so we do not have any updated number, but we will look at that further when we look at the Civil War. Okay, North Carolina jumped from 210 to 11,000. South Carolina, 200 enslaved people, jumping to 30,000 enslaved people. Virginia, 3,000 to 60,000. So you can really see how the institution of slavery really does take off in the Southern colonies. All right, we're going to move on to our next activity. Thank you guys for watching and paying attention.